What's that one? All right, it should be in the classroom. It should also be in the top left-hand corner of the screen for the Nearpod. So it should be VWK9D. So please let me know, are you seeing the Nearpod now? Can you see it?
Yes, I see it.
Yep. Okay, so VWK9D is the code for it. So if you could jump in there. Now, we've done aspects of this already, so this will be quite quick and easy for us. So if we could jump on in, that would be great. And if Isaac arrives, then we will add him into the list as well. Fantastic. All right. Now, when we introduced the role of the government, we discussed a range of things. We talked about the government being the producer and the consumer, and how they could be both at the same time. We talked about the government being involved in the economy and introducing different rules and different regulations. Okay, so employment laws, consumer protection laws, environmental protection laws, competition laws, intellectual property laws. All of those sorts of things, the government, you know, is involved in the economy and creating these particular rules and regulations. All right. Subsidies, taxes, tariffs, we discussed some of those, how they go in. And then we talked about these ideas of the roles of the government, and we've been discussing the idea of employment. We are going to be looking at inflation and growth and some inequality topics as well. So we will be looking at those as well. We need to just very quickly think about monetary policy and fiscal policy again. I'd like to just nail your understanding of these two major tools, and we're going to add a third. We're going to add supply side economics as well. All right. So monetary policy, we said, was relating to the money supply and the interest rates. So we're going to consider the central bank of the economy, which we've discussed before with regards to the role of money in the economy, the central bank using how much money there is in the economy, and also the interest rates to influence the level of spending and borrowing in an economy, which is going to affect the level of demand in an economy and therefore jobs and growth and all of those other objectives that we possibly might want to see, like price stability. Fiscal policy, we'd said, was about the government taxing and spending. So it's all about the revenue that the government earns, but also their spending decisions, what they choose to spend the money on. And at the moment, it is quite interesting watching America with regards to the huge amount of spending that they are planning. You know, it's in the trillions of dollars, which you can't, you know, really compare with other countries. But that amount of money, and seeing what they're spending it on and how they're choosing to spend it, then of course the tax implication that probably flows from that as well.
So, Mr. David?
Yeah.
Isn't it good for them? Like, because what I heard is they're spending it on infrastructure, right?
Yes, they are spending it on infrastructure. Hello, Isaac. Good to see you. Yes, indeed. That is the main thrust of what they're doing. And it's something that in America in particular is overdue. A lot of countries have underspent on infrastructure. Unfortunately, populations have no problems, Isaac. Populations and economies have grown, and it has been difficult for countries to kind of keep up with the infrastructure that's needed. So roads, bridges, housing, plumbing, even something as simple as the internet. All right, might surprise you to know that there are parts of America that don't have even 4G. They don't have that. All right, they might be lucky to have 2G internet. All right, where they are, and that's America. That's arguably the most developed country in the world. All right, and when you consider that, you've got to say they've got to do some investment. There are bridges. There was a bridge the other day. It was in the news. They had to actually close the bridge, like the main bridge, because there was a crack in it. Yeah, emphasis on arguably, absolutely. So they haven't invested in their infrastructure very much at all for, you know, a good 20 years, if not longer. And as a result of that, the infrastructure that they have isn't coping, and it is well past due from when they need to actually put a lot of money into their economy. So that's what they're trying. They're trying to, I guess, play catch up at this this particular moment. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see how successful that is. All right, if I just jump back now into the Nearpod, hopefully you see the screen. So again, a reminder, this is just to remind ourselves, we've gone through this already, we've discussed fiscal policy, we've discussed monetary policy, we're going to go a little bit more in depth and just have a little bit more of a look at it. So fiscal policy, taxation and spending, the desire for that is to see an increase or a decrease in the level of AD, aggregate demand, total demand in the economy. All right. Now, things that we've seen and we've discussed: social security, health spending, education spending, defense spending, housing spending, and even the repaying of debt is all examples of fiscal policy. So any one of these or several of them could be in an exam where it's discussed. Should this happen? Should they spend more on education? Should they spend more on defense? Right? Obviously, if you're going to spend more on defense, you might need to spend more on the road and the housing as well. Okay, we'll move past that joke. Right, fiscal policy, terminology. We've looked at these. The idea of it being expansionary, that's the language we need to use. Means that it is an attempt to grow or expand the economy. So the different fiscal aspects of the policy there is decreasing taxation or increasing government spending. Both of those two are considered to be expansionary policies. Contractionary policies are going to be ones that lead to an increase in taxation or decrease in government spending. It is possible to do them both, remember, because we've got, as we said in America, a big increase in government spending, right? So that's very expansionary, but at the same time, they're talking about increasing taxation, right, in order to help pay for the increase in government spending. So you can have fiscal policy that has more than one sort of approach, right? And therefore, sometimes the effect on the economy might be, we don't know, right? We're hoping for growth, but maybe the increase in tax might lead to less growth, and there could be, or the increase in tax might do exactly what they wanted to do by providing the revenue for the expansion that they wanted. All right, now I'm going to move past that. All right. Okay, so looking at taxation, okay, very quickly here, the idea that this is going to be the source of the government revenue, okay, so taxation, so maybe from the sales of goods and services, so goods and services taxes, VATs, or the sale of government-owned assets in and of themselves. So all sorts of different taxes, company taxes, income taxes, etc., and maybe the sales of goods and services, so that can be a tax, but also that the government themselves sell goods and services, but also the sale of government-owned assets as well. All right, now, I'm trying to remember if we've discussed the idea of a budget before. All right, if we have, that's cool. If we haven't, we need to. Right, so a budget is the plan for the income and expenditure. Now, you can have a personal budget. Mum and dad can have a personal budget. Right, the idea that you are planning out what your income is going to be and what you need to spend your money on. There's software programs and apps now that do this sort of thing for you. You just plug the numbers in and it plans it all out for you. Okay, but for the government, it's quite large, obviously, because the amount of income and expenditures that we're talking about are a lot of money. All right, so if we're considering deficits, right, a deficit is going to be where the income of the government or the individual is less than their spending, their expenses. So they're spending more than they're earning with regards to income. If a budget is called balanced, then the income equals your expenditure. If there is a surplus in your budget, then the income is going to be greater than your expenditure. So that's about the language that we're using. Deficits, or a deficit budget, a balanced budget, or a surplus budget, or a budget that's in surplus. Again, it's about the language that they use in an exam, but also there's a little bit of calculation that could possibly happen here too. So it could be, here's the government's revenue, here's what they're spending the money on. Is it a, what would you call it? Is it a deficit? Is it a surplus? Okay. All right. Okay, so just moving on past those. We covered those a little bit before. All right, taxation. Now, all right, if taxation is called direct, then we consider that tax to be paid directly to the government. So classic direct taxes would be income taxes and company taxes. Sometimes they call it by different names, right? Income tax and company tax. So in New Zealand, the income tax is called PAYE, or pay as you earn. And I don't know about other places, it may just be called income tax. Company taxes, again, it could be referred to as company revenue tax, along those sorts of lines. Indirect taxes, they're the ones that get paid indirectly to the government. They still go to the government, but they just don't go straight there. They go by a roundabout path. And ones that we are most familiar with would be GST or SST, so sales and service tax or goods and services tax, VAT, particularly from the UK, value-added tax. Those are taxes that get added to the cost of goods and services. So the producer, so the consumer pays the tax, it goes to the producer, then the producer has to then pay it to the government. So it does go there, it just goes via an indirect route. Right? Regressive taxes, those are taxes that increase as a proportion as your income increases. Right? They're called a progressive tax. So the proportion of tax paid increases as your income increases. Those are considered really good in the sense that they will help with the income distribution. So those who are earning a lot and a lot and a lot of income, this would then be a tax that would help to perhaps rebalance some of the income inequalities that we might see. A regressive tax is a tax that the proportion of the tax that's paid actually decreases as your income increases. So regressive taxes tend to be quite hard on the people with lower incomes and quite easy potentially on those with higher incomes. There are taxes that behave like regressive taxes, but actually pure regressive taxes are quite hard to find. Then there are what's called proportional taxes. They're the ones that are the same proportion that it gets paid regardless of the income level that there is, that you earn. Right, so here's what I need you to do. In the Nearpod, you're going to be matching the terms. You're going to try and figure out whether it is proportional, whether it is progressive, or whether it is regressive. So have a go, see how you get on. Okay. Good work, team. Maybe Eric and Andy have a go. Yasin. Yep, pretty good. Where Isaac? I don't see Isaac in the Nearpod. All right, so it's matching the terms. Try and match the terms. All right. So what we're after, okay, wait a couple more seconds. Have another go, Eric. Good man. All right, so the progressive tax, we said, was where the individuals were paying a higher percentage of their income in tax, because it's progressive, which means increasing. So the word progressive, you progress, you increase. Proportional taxes, they pay a fixed proportion of their income. It's proportional, so they pay a fixed proportion, and a regressive tax. That's where they pay less proportionally of their income as their income rises, right? It regresses, it goes backwards, if you will. All right, so there is lots of impact of taxation, and we've discussed a little bit about this in the past, but things like the price and the quantity, we know that if there are taxes put on goods and services in particular, the prices of those will rise, and we would expect the quantity demanded to decrease. Right? There is impact on economic growth. If there is an increase in taxes, we would assume that there would be less income, potentially less spending on goods and services, as in the quantities decreasing, therefore less employment, and therefore, again, less income as it goes forward. So it may lead to a decrease in economic growth. An impact on inflation is a little bit trickier because it depends on the tax. If it's a tax on goods and services, then it might mean that the prices of those goods and services rise, so therefore that can have an effect on inflation. Right? If it's a tax on income or a tax on businesses, like corporate tax, corporate income tax, then it might be that all it does is decrease economic growth, therefore possibly decrease inflation. If it's what about business location? Well, we might see that if taxes are put on specific locations, then businesses might choose to move to different locations where the taxes aren't as favorable or more favorable. Right? It might be that they move to an entire different country, okay, because their tax model is more favorable. Social behavior, again, that same sort of idea with regards to taxes and who is taxed and who isn't taxed, and how you behave on the basis of the income levels that you have. Tax incentives, incentives to work. If you are taxed more based on the income that you earn, then how likely are you to work harder? Will it have an impact on you working harder because there's more tax? Okay, there's a lot of debate about the incentive with regards to that one. Tax avoidance and tax evasion. The more taxes there are, the more likely it is that people will try to avoid paying tax. They may even, that's illegal, they may even evade paying taxes, right? Impact of distribution of wealth. Again, it's that same basic idea. If you don't have the income, then you're going to have less wealth. By wealth, we're talking about the assets that you own. Right? So without the income, because of the taxes potentially, you aren't able to generate the income and generate the wealth from the income. Now, just an example here of a practice exam question. How an increase in tax could conflict with any two macroeconomic objectives of the government. Oh, that would be a tricky one. So you've got to remember back to your macroeconomic objectives of the government. So income inequality, right, or equality, price level, price stability, employment, right, economic growth. So you can pick a couple of those and try and figure out how, if taxes rise, how might they affect those objectives? All right, there's a video there that's in the slides. You can look at those. All right. Now, so contractionary and expansionary, we can think about fiscal policy examples from around the world. But one of the key skills we're now needing to do is to evaluate, to think about the advantages and disadvantages of these particular policies. So, if we're talking fiscal policy, one of the big issues is the idea of recognition. The government needs to see that it needs to intervene. And again, if you're keeping up with the United States, you will have well seen that there are politicians who don't feel that the government does need to intervene, right? That it perhaps works better when it doesn't. So the government needs to see that there's a problem. And if it doesn't see that there's a problem, then it's not going to intervene. There is also what's called a time lag or an administrative lag, all right? And the administrative lag is how long it takes for the government to actually pass the policies through the system of government. And again, you've got to use America as an example with regards to that, because it takes them an awful long time to get through their governing system, right? Weeks, if not months, potentially, of time. And then, of course, the impact lags as well. So there's a lag, or a time period between when the policy is implemented, when the policy is actually put in place, and the effect of that policy. So you might increase spending now, but the effect of that increase in spending might not actually happen until 6 months later, a year later, 2 years later, right? It depends on what the effect is. So you kind of have to think about whether the fiscal policy is solving a problem that is occurring now, or whether it's put in place to solve a problem that hasn't happened yet, right? Which becomes a lot more tricky to actually implement. So this idea here, here's another practice exam question that you can work your way through when you're doing your revision. Explain why expansionary fiscal policies could cause a budget deficit for the government. That's a little bit more straightforward. It's just using those calculations about government spending and government revenue. So if we have a bit of a review about monetary policy, just very quickly, right? When we learned about money, we decided that money was what we used in our economy to solve our double coincidence of wants. It had particular functions that it needed to serve, okay? So things like the medium of exchange. Money needed to be in the middle of the exchange, right? The unit of account, the store of value, all of those need to be able to happen in order for money to do its job. In real life, we see this sort of model occurring in our economy. It's a little complicated, I apologize, but in essence what we say is that money has, because we've got quite a broad definition for what money actually is, because it is theoretically possible for you to sell an asset and use the asset as money, okay? So Bitcoin, for example, is an asset, it's not money. So therefore, the people who are selling Bitcoin and buying Bitcoin aren't buying money, right? They are buying an asset that they're then potentially able to use as money. So therefore, we need this giant definition. So M3 is going to be like the universe of money. Everything and anything that could possibly be considered as money is in M3. M2 are things that are in the universe of money, but they're not everything, right? There are less things in M2 than there are in M3. So M2 is things that are more what's called liquid. So they're more likely to be money. So some of those physical assets like paintings and cars and private planes and the house that you have, all of those assets which could be used as a form of money aren't necessarily in M2 because they're not quite as liquid as the things that are in M2. Not quite as easy to use as money. M1 is the smallest number, so it is the smallest definition for what money actually is. So it is the most liquid. So it is going to be the things that are the notes and the coins. It is going to be the things that are in your actual bank account. So you can move things from your bank account and create assets from them, right? That then becomes more wealth in that regard. Or you can use some of the wealth that you have and convert it into actual notes and coins. So when we talk about money in economics, sometimes it's useful to consider the degree of liquidity, right? How easy it is to use it, particularly at the moment because of people using things like Bitcoin and the like. Slowly. Now we talked about the central bank, all the way back when we talked about money, and how the central bank operated as a bank for banks. The central bank also operates as a bank for the government. So therefore it controls a lot of, in fact, pretty much all of the money in the economy. And it is then able to implement monetary policy on behalf of the government. So if the government wants there to be more money in the economy, the central bank can do that. If the government wants interest rates to be changed, the central bank can do that. So we talked about monetary policy. It can be expansionary or contractionary. So when we're thinking expansionary, then our interest rates are going to decrease. Our money supply should be increasing. Right? We are allowing more people to have money. We are expanding the amount of money in the economy so that people can go and buy more things. People are happier to borrow money in order to go and buy more things, creating more demand, therefore increasing economic growth. Right? That's the idea there. Contractionary monetary policy is the reverse. So increasing interest rates and decreasing the money supply. So in that case, you're making the balloon, if you like, shrink, okay? And you are making it more expensive to borrow money. You are reducing the amount of money that's actually in the economy. And by doing all of that, you are reducing the level of demand, etc., and potentially jobs in the economy as well. Now, there are lots of monetary policy examples that we can see around the world, countries that have increased interest rates or decreased interest rates. They're all very useful for you to have at your fingertips, right? Just different case studies, because in your exam, there will be case studies of perhaps fiscal policy or maybe monetary policy, and you will then need to explain those. So having some real life examples that you have found are useful. Now, there are some unusual tools that they use, and some of them are a little bit more complicated than others. So there's something called a discount rate. Now, in America, that's the terminology that they use. Now, the easiest way to think about the discount rate is to consider it the interest rate that the Reserve Bank or the central bank has with the government, with the other banks. Now, in New Zealand, it's not called a discount rate. It's actually called an official cash rate, or OCR. Other countries, it might have a different name. So in America, it's a discount rate. All right, so just in case you're reading articles, you're reading case studies, and they use the phrase discount rate, you need to know that that is the interest rate that the central bank charges the other banks. There is also something called a bond market. The bond market acts it's kind of the opposite of the money market, all right? So the idea is that the bond market is where the government is able to borrow money through issuing, if you like, what's called an IOU, right? A little wee certificate that says, yeah, we'll pay you back the money, and we'll pay it back with, you know, a little bit of interest. So the bond market is a way that the central bank can increase the money supply or decrease the money supply by issuing bonds, right? Obviously, your favorite one is James, right? But by issuing bonds, the central bank is decreasing the money supply, okay? Because you buy the bond yourself as an investment, therefore you're paying for that bond, all right? So therefore you have less money, but you have this nice wee certificate that says you'll get that money back in the future with a little bit of interest. Now, at the moment in America, there are 30-year bonds and 20-year bonds and 10-year bonds and 5-year bonds. And that's the idea, that they, after that period of time, you'd get your money back, right, with interest. There's also something that they use, and again, it comes up sometimes in articles that you read, particularly from America, called a reserve requirement. And in that situation, the Reserve Bank, the central bank, is going to require by law how much of the deposits in your bank you have to hold on to as a reserve. So in essence, they're saying you're allowed to lend out this much money, but you have to hold this much in reserve. So a reserve requirement will dictate from the government how much you're allowed to, as a bank, lend out to people, right? So if you have $100 in deposit and you decide to hold on to $20 of that as reserve, then that's a 20% reserve, right? Expressed as a percentage. The government might say you need to have 20% reserve, or they might say you need to have 10% reserve, which means you're allowed to lend out more of the money, right? You need to have 5% reserve. You're allowed to lend out even more of the money, right? So the smaller the reserve requirement is, the more the banks are allowed to lend out into the market. Right? Also tells about how confident they are with regards to the market. Now, there are lots of videos that you can find. There's one from Mr. Clifford. You'll be able to look through that about monetary policy and how it works. But we also need to say, is monetary policy good or not? What are the advantages to it? What are the disadvantages to it? So we do need to consider critically how monetary policy is used. And again, we've still got that same problem, like we did with fiscal policy, that there are going to be time lags. There are going to be, moments where you put the policy in place, but it won't affect consumers and producers immediately. It will take time. So therefore, the effect, because it takes time, it may be that by the time the policy takes effect, the situation of the economy could be very different. Right? So, that's something that we definitely need to consider. Also, the consumer and business behavior in and of themselves. The monetary policy is based around the idea that this is how a consumer will behave. But what if they don't? All right? So let's increase interest rates. Well, in theory, consumers should decrease the amount that they borrow. But what if they don't? How big an increase in interest rates is actually needed in order for people to decrease their spending, their behavior, right? Similarly with businesses, how big an increase does it need to be? All right, we have to understand that, consumers borrow money all the time, but, how big a change in interest rates would it need to be in order for them to say, oh, no, I don't know that I want to borrow any more money? There are also a lot of external effects that we aren't taking into account. Things like people's income levels. We're not taking that into account. They could have had a pay rise, and therefore, well, it doesn't matter. I will still borrow the money. I will still spend the money. We should also consider fiscal policy. So although we are maybe contracting with monetary policy, we might be expanding with fiscal policy. That's actually possible. In which case, we've got to try and weigh up or balance up the difference between the two policies and the effects of them. And that's quite a complicated thing to do. We also need to understand that the government's objectives may change over time. We may be worried about inflation one year and unemployment the next. So when we are evaluating monetary policy, we also need to consider, or we need to remember that there are going to be trade-offs. So the idea that we are trying to control inflation, right, will lead to us having an impact on the level of employment. If we are attempting to impact on employment, it's going to conflict with our goal about inflation. So whatever we do, we're going to have a trade-off with another policy objective. So we need to make sure we understand that, so that when we are evaluating these policies, we're able to include that information in there. Right, now, here we go. Those of you who remember the 1980s, which is none of you, right? You will have seen it on television, I'm sure, in the many movies, etc., that there are that link back to the 1980s. We can talk about something called supply-side economics, favored by this gentleman, who some of you might recognize. In fact, I'm going to ask, who recognizes the gentleman on the left? Let's go back to the chat. Who is the gentleman on the left?
Isn't that President Reagan?
Well done. Gosh, first out the boat. Well done. Yes, indeed, it is former US President Ronald Reagan. All right. Now, you might be quite fascinated to know that he had a job before he was president. Does anybody know what the job that he had before he was president was? What was Ronald Reagan's job before he was US president? Very famous job too. Anybody know? He wasn't an economist. He was definitely not that.
Dad, when are we going to do my school project?
When I've done my lesson.
Okay. I love you.
Love you too. All right, what do we think, team? What was Ronald Reagan's job? Yes, well done. He was an actor. Before he was president, he was an actor, which is, yeah, well, no, he wasn't any of that. Oh, yes, he was actually. You're right. But principally, he was an actor and starred in a few movies. And, you know, there is kind of a surrealness with regards to that you would actually then have an actor become president, right? Because you kind of think, well, you know, was he acting as president, right? In any case, he very much favored this economic principle, this economic policy of supply-side economics. Now, to be perfectly honest, and I will be honest with you, supply-side economics is something that there is a lot of problems with, okay? But it is quite interesting as a comparison. So, supply-side policies are longer-term strategies aimed at increasing the productive capacity of the country. So that PPC curve, these are the policies trying to shift that PPC curve out. So you're wanting to improve the quality and or quantity of your factors of production. More factors of production, or, you know, more productive factors of production. So things that we could think about, and you've seen these. Privatization, right? Moving what was a government-run business into the private sector. There are going to be real-life examples of those. There are lots in the UK, lots in New Zealand. We can find out lots of examples of them, and it would be useful for you to have a real-life example of privatization. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to stop sharing. We're going to jump back to the meat. In the chat function, see if you can find any real-life examples of privatization and put them into the chat function. 2 seconds. Go. Real-life examples of privatization. Any country, anywhere in the world. See what you can come up with. Let's see if Dr. Google can help. Is it left? Okay. TNB Malaysia. Right. I don't know that one, but yes, okay.
That's the like power supply.
The electricity company.
Yeah.
Okay. That's a good one. BC Ferries Corporation. I don't know where that one is. All right. Okay. All right, so the idea is if it's privatization, they used to be owned and run by the government, and they now are owned and run by the private sector. There are quite a few that you can find, I'm sure. Are you drinking, son? You drink some more water, please. Thank you.
Is your lesson done?
Not yet, son. No? Okay. Well, maybe we can add that to our list of things to do later on, is to find real-life examples of privatization. Right. Now, another supply-side policy is this idea of deregulation. So we know what regulation is. We talked a lot about that just a little while ago. We were putting rules in place in the economy, but if we are deregulating, then we are taking the rules and regulations off. So let's get rid of the minimum wage. Let's get rid of the rules about, taxes. Let's get rid of the rules about emission standards for vehicles. All of these sorts of ideas is get rid of the rules. Right? With the idea being that if there are less rules, businesses should be more efficient at what they do and therefore produce more output, right? And therefore more jobs, more growth, that sort of idea. And again, there's probably a lot of real life examples of deregulation you can find. For example, things like the taxi industry. I know in New Zealand this was the case. There was deregulation of the taxi industry, which allowed businesses like the Grabs of this world to set up. Because before then, there was a lot of rules and regulations about taxiing and what a taxi service was all about. And then, of course, Grab came along. And now, yes, there are now new rules and regulations about Grab and what they're allowed to do and not allowed to do. But you get the idea, right? That if you got rid of those rules and regulations, there'd be more business, right? So, health and safety requirements. Well, if you got rid of those, it'd be a whole lot cheaper to produce a lot of things, but would you really want them? Yeah. And then this idea about infrastructure investment, the idea of capital investment in an economy, the idea of building roads, building bridges, like we talked about in America, something that is desperately needed potentially, but is it always effective? If you consider things like the Belt and Road Initiative that China is involved with all around the world, well, it sounds amazing. And yeah, there's going to be a lot of gains from it, but are they always effective? Right? They build the road, people have to travel on the road. And we know that countries like China have built huge infrastructure projects, massive big cities, and they've been empty. Right? They haven't had people in them, the ghost cities. Right? We know that. So although investment in infrastructure is really important and very significant as a supply side policy, definitely more longer term, right? Not necessarily always effective. Right? I mean, think how long it takes to build roads and bridges and rail lines. Okay. Well, by the time they've finished building the road and the bridge and whatever else, maybe it's now less effective. And they need to build another road. All right. It's one of those sort of laws that people kind of expand to fill. So you build a new road and all of a sudden it gets full with cars again. So then you have to build another road. Right? So what do we need to be able to do? We need to be able to define key terms. We need to be able to analyze real life situations, and we need to be able to critically evaluate them, saying, does it work? Right? So when you look at those supply side policies, right, things that you can think about: education, human capital investment, right? How effective is human capital investment? So how effective is education? Let's go back to the meat. In the chat section, how effective is education? If the government was to invest heavily in education in Malaysia, will it work? What will it do? What could some of the problems be with investing in education in Malaysia? What do you think?
Wait, problems with investing in education?
Yes. Because quite often we will say, let's invest more in education. Yes, but what might possible problems be? What could you see happening? Opportunity cost is absolutely one of the problems that could There could be. Invest in education, you don't have then that money to invest elsewhere. Yes, you're absolutely right. Any other problems that you could see? There's two rather large ones that kind of stare us in the face with regards to human capital investment. All right. First one is a relatively small word beginning with the letter T. And we need to pay mind to it quite a lot, particularly at the moment.
Teachers.
Close. Some of you carry it around with you on your wrist. Others of you have it in your phones.
Good.
I'll give you a clue. I'm keeping an eye on it. It's in the top right-hand corner of my screen.
Time.
Time. Yeah. Got to be very mindful of time. Education isn't something that happens. Yes, well done. Short-term problems. Education is a long-term investment. Absolutely right, Tracy. Well done. Rock star. Yes. Right. Education takes time, and it's not a quick fix. And those of you who, well, you guys are in you're effectively year 11 now. All right. So have a look at how long you've been at school already, and then look at how long you're going to be in school. And then that's not the end of it, because then you're looking at possibly going to university, and how long are you going to spend at university? If you're wanting advanced degrees, postgraduate, then there's more time. Yeah. Some people might want double doctorates, triple doctorates, I don't know, and that's even longer. Yeah. So time, it takes time. And education isn't going to necessarily fix things in short term. Investment failures, yes, that's true. It could be. I don't know about in education, but possibly. Yeah. So just thinking about education, about how long it takes. So you can put more money in education, but the end result of the education isn't going to occur until maybe 10 years later, maybe 15 years, 20 years later. There's another big problem with education that you guys see, and it's more personal, it's more individual. So part of it's to do with the word beginning with M. Another part of it is to do with, word beginning with M, but also a word beginning with A. That might be a bit more tricky, the M and the A word. Quite a long word beginning with M. M. Yeah, M or M and A. Yeah. So very personal to you, right? The M word. Something mum and dad might talk to you about, hopefully not too often, but they might. I know I've had many conversations with my 7, nearly 8-year-old about this M word.
Money.
Sorry. Yes, we do have those conversations as well. Slightly longer word than money. All right. Starts with M, ends in N. Yep, that's the one. And has the word motive somewhere in the middle.
Motivation.
Motivation, yeah. And again, hopefully you don't have that conversation too often. But there's a very old, I think it's a proverb or saying about leading a horse to water. You can create the best education that there possibly is. But the problem with education is that it's very individual, it's very personal. And you can have amazing things like all the whiz-bang everything. That's the one. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink it. That's absolutely right. But it's down to the motivation of the individual, right? And you know this for yourself, how motivated you are. It's harder now because you're all at home. Much harder to be motivated when you're at home. Yeah, and that's the issue that we have with our 7, nearly 8-year-old, all right? Who's at home, sees all of his toys, sees his TV, sees all of that, and thinks, well, why would I bother doing schoolwork when I've got toys to play with and TV that I can watch? Yeah. All right. So motivation. Yes, the other one is ability. You're hoping that education will lead to improvements in ability, but it doesn't always. Yeah. I mean, we understand that. You can train really, really hard at a sport, but it doesn't guarantee you're going to get better at the sport. You hope you will, but it's the same thing. Everybody has a limit to what they can do. We can improve, yes, we can. But at some point, you're going to reach a point where, yeah, I just cannot do that. I struggled with maths at school at times. Not always, but at times. And then at university, some of the economics maths I had to do, I tell you, it was fun. But I reached the limit to my maths, right, when I was at university, trying to work out ordinary least square regression models. Oh, here's a fun word for you. I had to work out what's called heteroscedasticity. I tell you, economics has got the best words. And I had to discuss things like multicollinearity. Right? Now, I can remember the words, cannot remember what they mean, okay? And that was pretty much the sum total of what I was able to do. I did physics at school, right? I read some physics books. I'm interested in physics. Physics interests me. But my abilities in physics do hit a wall rather close to my level of interest. Right? So motivation and ability are going to have an impact on education. So you can have an amazing school, you can have an amazing education program, a fantastic assessment model, whatever it is. But at some point, it's got to be the learners who achieve. And it can be little things. It can be, the education program we run it in English, okay? But that's not everybody's first language. So when you are learning, if English isn't your first language, in your head, you're trying to translate everything potentially into a different language and a different understanding. Now that's hard to do at the best of times, but you're dealing with subjects which are quite complex. And I mean, maths might be quite straightforward potentially, science might be quite straightforward potentially, but economics, with all of the complexity and terminology that we use, and the contextualizing that we use as well, the context that we apply for the case studies, right, can be quite difficult. Right? So to cut a long story short, education isn't necessarily a guarantee that it will lead to an improvement in the quality of labour. We hope that it will. That's definitely the theory and the assumption, but it's not guaranteed. All right. Now, you might have heard, tax reforms. Okay, so changing the tax models. So looking at the progressive nature of the tax system and maybe increasing taxes to some people and decreasing taxes to others, that can be successful, all right? But also may not be. And there are lots of real life examples. That's one of the things they're trying to do in America at the moment. They're trying to remodel their tax system to make it fairer, but and also to increase the revenue that they're able to get from it, something that's well overdue again. China did a lot of this, the idea of creating enterprise zones, areas within the country where you can do a lot of business, okay, where they take away a lot of rules and regulations potentially, and where there is a lot of business that happens. New Zealand created things called incubators, or business incubators, right? Where
it's a Red Bull.
It is a Red Bull. Where the expert advice about businesses is placed in one particular area, and that's where you go to do business and to set up your business, to develop it. All right. So where we lived in China was an enterprise zone. We lived in Suzhou industrial zone, basically, and it was considered an enterprise zone. How effective are they? Well, again, it's not every business will be successful that goes through those, but a lot of businesses that go through there will. All right. And it's potentially one of those points where anything can help. Right? It's definitely dramatically helped in China, right, that particular approach. So are there advantages to supply side policies? Yes, there are. We do see, in theory, right, when we employ supply side policies, we do see higher economic growth, right, because of the investment, We see more jobs being created. We see more output being created, and therefore economic growth. It is possible that because of supply side policy, we can see lower inflation. There's an increase in productivity within the economy. So we can actually get growth, increase output, etc., without inflation. It can lower unemployment, right? Particularly unemployment that is maybe frictional and maybe structural, but right, might take longer, and there are costs and opportunity costs, etc., involved. And it might lead to an improvement in the balance of payments, right? More competitiveness and hopefully more export earnings as well. So these are all good advantages to the use of supply side policy. So you get a question that discusses, is supply side economics or supply side policies the best way to improve economic growth in Uzbekistan? Then you'd use these sorts of points as advantages for. There are going to be disadvantages. So we've talked about the time lags involved, right? We've talked about how there needs to be a level of investment and innovation, and sometimes it doesn't work, right? It is possible that the government might be trying to pick winners. And if the government tries to pick the winners, i.e. the government says we're going to reduce taxes, but only taxes for these particular businesses or this particular industry, then there's a chance the government's going to get it wrong. Right? Remember, this is the government saying, oh, we're going to increase our investment in education, and we're going to increase our investment in education in this particular region. Well, maybe it's the wrong region to invest there in the education. Maybe you need to invest it in this other region. So we're trusting that their decisions are going to be the right ones. Okay. And again, sustainability. Is it long term? Will it actually improve economic growth without there being the potential increase in externalities like pollution, etc.? So there is lots that can be considered with regards to the negatives, potentially, of supply side policies. Right? Long term takes years. You still need to think about the demand side. It could actually lead to greater income inequality. And this is what America found. When Ronald Reagan did implement supply side economics in America, one of the biggest changes that occurred was huge increases in income inequality. Right? You might have heard the expression, the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. Well, that happened in America tremendously. Right? And it's still occurring. Right? Okay, so that's one of the areas in America that they desperately need to address in the next little while. Hopefully are. The government doesn't know all the answers, and sometimes the government gets things wrong, just like the rest of us. So if that's the case, then some of their decisions, some of their policies might actually not work, or not work the way they want them to. And again, we've got to think about sustainability. We've got to think about the environment. We've got to think about how this will affect the future economy that we and our families will live in. So lots of possible disadvantages that we could consider, right? And here's the sort of the exam-based idea here. What are the limitations to using the fiscal, monetary, and supply side policy in order to control economic activity? So that's a really big, very meaty question, sort of the 8-mark sort of end of the spectrum, all right? Now I'm going to stop the sharing there, jump back to the meat. There we are, 18. All right, now, there's a lot of theory that we've gone through, okay? Fiscal policy, monetary policy, the advantages and disadvantages of each, and then supply side as an alternative policy with the advantages and disadvantages of that. So the idea being is that the examiner might be wanting you to discuss fiscal policy or monetary policy and use the however we could implement supply side policy. But supply side policy might lead to ... So as an alternative, right? So all of that bundled together is quite a lot of material for you to cover today. And hopefully you will be able to review that. Right, now there was a number of exercises and extra materials that have been posted of late. Please be working through those, finish them off if you haven't finished them off already. I've also posted a review document into the classroom. I'm not suggesting you have to use that, right? I am going to be posting summer work. Yes, I will. Don't panic. Don't panic. I'm not suggesting you have to use the review document, but there are a couple of learners across the year 10s whose mid-course results weren't quite what they were wanting, right? And therefore they have asked for extra targeted review material, hence the creation of basically a calendared review document. So in the month of June, I'm going to go through these things. Here is the evidence for me doing that. And it can be something you've already done or something that you're going to do, right? And put that in there, right? So if that is useful to you, use it. If it's not useful to you, don't use it, right? So that's what you're going to be working on. So reviewing the material, I'll post a link to the video of the recording of the lesson, all right? So you can review that and add depth to your notes. And please do add that depth, particularly the evaluation skill, all right? Because we're now at the point where you're needing to link several ideas together. Okay. We're now at the point where you are using different models and a lot of terminology in your answers. You're going to need to structure paragraph length answers, right? Multiple numbers of them, right? With different case studies involved. So starting to add depth to your understanding, but also your notes is a really good thing to be able to do. Please email me any questions that you have. Otherwise, you can have a little bit of a break before your next lesson and have a bit of a downtime away from the screen would be a good thing to do. Otherwise, as we'd say in the land of my birth, hei konera, which means goodbye for now. Unless you've got any particular last minute questions you want to answer, you can head on off and do some review, reflection, quiet time before your 11:40 lesson, whatever that might be. Okay?
Thank you, Mr. David.
Thank you. See you.
Thank you, Mr. David.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. David.
See you. All right, so